So, with advice from two forums, 6502.org and vcfed.org, I'll work through the board with my cheap Amazon scope. The first problem we noticed that D7 wasn't counting. Its neighbour, right next to it, D6, was working just fine. Both were using the same clock, both were connected to E6, so D7 seemed like a likely candidate for failure. So I replaced it and there was no change. Since E6 is connected to D7 and feeds its inputs, I then replaced that. That too made no difference, so I looked to C2. Now, this had previously been supplying a working clock to E6, but for some reason I could no longer detect a pulse. One half of C2's output is fed by B1, which is fed by A1, and A1 I'd previously tested and that seemed to be working just fine, but now that wasn't working either. So this is where it became obvious that my cheap Amazon scope with its limited 200 kHz bandwidth wasn't up to the job. And one member on the forum advised me to run a few checks that could detect the presence of signals my scope couldn't measure, and it appeared from those checks that there might be a problem with C8. So I changed C8 and I was fully expecting nothing to happen, but to my relief the display went from a very thin horizontal line to a much brighter bar with a margin about where you'd expect to see one. And I could also see some vague detail as well. Faulty sort of splodges along the line, which, given that the display is 40 columns wide, was a very good sign. Further online advice suggested I replace chips D5 and D6. Now doing that improved the focus of the bar I was seeing on the display, and I could now see some sort of barely discernible characters like sort of like checkerboard character, where previously I could only see blurred blocks. So that was another step forward. At that point I found a good Tektronix scope on eBay for 100 quid, and I was the only bidder and managed to get it, and it's in very good condition and seems to be working fine. I could now take reliable measurements around the board, no matter what the frequency, so that was very helpful to have that. So the guys on the forum at this point had a very good idea what the fault was, and they suggested it was either E5 or E8. Both of these chips eventually feed D8, which is where the vertical sync comes from. So I replaced E8, no change. Then I replaced E5, and this is what happened. Yes! It was really great to finally see something on the screen, some indication that the system side of the board was actually working. I corrected the vertical height and decided to swap some of the video RAM around to see what difference that might make. That then gave me the traditional random garbage screen, which suggested that the video RAM I'd removed is faulty. Swapping and changing some of the board's other RAM chips suggests that most of them are dead or dying, which isn't unusual, but it's unfortunate since nobody makes these chips anymore. They're completely obsolete. I had another issue though. The tape machine was still whirring away all the time. It should stop once the computer has been powered up, and the random characters on screen should only be there for a moment before the CPU clears them. When the PET's turned on, there's a little timing chip that holds the CPU in reset mode for just a second or two before allowing it to function, and we worked out that the timing chip was holding the CPU permanently in reset mode. So I changed it for a new chip, and that made no difference. The timing on that chip is controlled by two capacitors, and I realised that one of them wasn't charging up. It was almost, not quite, but almost short circuit, and since it wasn't charging up, it would always allow current to flow through it, and that meant that the voltage across it would always be relatively low, and that the timing chip would therefore never let the CPU work. And once that capacitor was changed, the CPU immediately began to function, and this is where I'm at now. The CPU is no longer being held in reset, the tape machine is being initialized, the screen is being cleared, but for some reason the CPU can't do much else, and I suspect this is because some of the ROM and RAM chips are faulty, so I'm working on creating a small hack to force the CPU into a mode which will allow me to see in more detail what's happening across the board.